This is a story about a man who spent most of his life doing the same hard work, without applause, and why staying faithful to one path quietly changed everything. Brian Adams didn't feel tired when he pulled the ambulance door shut. He felt hollow, the kind of quiet that comes after too much noise, when your hands still shake, but your mind has already moved on. The radio crackled with a call he wasn't assigned to. He listened anyway. He always did. It felt wrong not to. Like turning your back on something that might still need you. Day after New Year, he thought. Everyone thinks it's over now. The engine idled. Snowmelt ran in thin lines along the curb. Brian rested his forehead against the cold glass for half a second, just long enough to feel the chill, then straightened up. Brian had learned, over 27 years as an EMT, that pressure didn't announce itself. It slipped in quietly, through routine, through habits that once kept you alive and now just kept you moving. He checked the equipment again, though he already knew it was fine. He always did this at the end of a shift, counting, touching, confirming, as if order could keep something else from falling apart. His hands were steady. His chest was not. What he wanted, though he never said it out loud, was simple: to come home and not feel like he was leaving something of himself behind in the rig. What he feared was even simpler, that if he stopped, even for a moment, everything he'd built his identity on would collapse. At home, Sandra would be making coffee by now. Strong. Too strong. She said it helped her feel like the day had weight. Kyla would still be asleep, one arm flung over the edge of the bed, dreaming without knowing how rare that luxury was. Max would hear Brian's truck before it turned onto their street. That thought kept him going more than he liked to admit. The call that finally came wasn't dramatic. Single vehicle. No sirens needed. Minor injuries. Brian exhaled, relief mixed with something dangerously close to disappointment. He hated that feeling. Hated what it said about how far he'd drifted from the man he used to be. As the ambulance rolled forward, Brian caught his reflection in the side mirror. 57. Lines etched deeper this winter. Eyes calm. Yes, but carrying something unspoken. He wondered, not for the first time, how long a person could keep being strong for everyone else before faith started to feel like stubbornness. The road stretched ahead, familiar and unforgiving. Brian drove into it anyway. The call ended the same way most of them did. No names. No faces he would remember tomorrow. Just a stretcher sliding back into place and the quiet click of a latch closing. Brian wiped his hands with a paper towel that didn't quite clean the smell away. He sat back down in the driver's seat and let the engine run. The heater hummed. Outside, the sky hung low and colorless, like it hadn't decided what kind of day it wanted to be. He checked the time. Too early to go home. Too late to feel fresh. This was the space he knew best. Brian drove without the radio. He used to keep it on. News, music, anything to fill the gaps. But somewhere along the years he'd turned it off for good. Silence felt more honest. It didn't pretend to comfort you. At a stoplight, he noticed his hands again. Still steady. They always were when someone else needed them to be. That was the strange part. In emergencies, his body never hesitated. Never shook. It was only afterward, alone, between calls, that doubt crept in. Like the cost of staying calm had to be paid eventually. He wondered, briefly, if that was what faith really was. Not certainty, just showing up anyway. At the station, the younger EMTs talked about their plans. New trucks, promotions, switching departments. Brian listened with half an ear, nodding when it felt appropriate. He'd heard every version of those conversations before. Some of the men he'd trained were supervisors now. Some had left medicine entirely. A few had burned out hard and loud, like a fire that didn't know when to stop feeding itself. Brian stayed. No speeches, no declarations, just stayed. Sandra's text came through while he was restocking supplies. "You okay?" He stared at the screen longer than necessary. "Yeah," he typed back, then paused, added, "Just tired." She replied almost immediately, "Dinner's ready whenever you are." That did something to him. Something small, but real. Brian leaned against the counter and closed his eyes for a second. Not to rest, just to feel where he was. to remind himself he still had a place to return to. Later, back on the road, the dispatcher's voice crackled again. Different address, different situation. Brian reached for the wheel, instinctive and practiced. As the ambulance pulled into traffic, a thought followed him. Quiet, persistent, impossible to shake. What if this calm I'm so good at carrying for others is the only thing keeping me from noticing how close I am to empty? He didn't answer the question. He couldn't yet. The siren stayed off. The road opened ahead, and Brian drove on, faithful to the work, even as something inside him waited for a sign or a permission or a moment where staying didn't feel like the only option left. The call came just after noon. Not urgent, not routine either. Brian recognized the address before the dispatcher finished speaking. A retirement complex on the east side. Assisted living mostly. The kind of place where time slowed down and everything felt a little more fragile because of it. When they arrived, the doors were already open. A nurse stood waiting, arms folded tight across her chest. "He collapsed in the hallway," she said. "Was conscious when we found him. Scared. Scared mattered." Brian nodded and grabbed the kit. The man was sitting on the floor when they reached him. Late 60s, maybe older. Eyes wide, breathing fast, hands trembling in a way Brian recognized immediately. "Hey," Brian said gently, kneeling down. "I'm Brian. You're not alone." The man latched onto that sentence like it was a rope. As Brian checked vitals, talked him through slowing his breath, something strange happened. The room went quiet, not externally, but inside Brian himself. The familiar narrowing, the focus, the calm that always arrived when someone else needed it more than he did. "You work here a long time?" the man asked suddenly. Brian smiled faintly. "Long enough." "Me too," the man said. "Same factory. 40 years. Then one day, it's just gone." That landed. Brian's hands didn't falter, but something in his chest did. The call ended well. No transport needed. Just rest. Follow-up. Reassurance. As Brian packed up, the nurse touched his arm. "You're good at this," she said quietly. "He calmed down the moment you spoke." Brian nodded, unsure what to do with the compliment. Good at this. He'd been good at this for a long time. The question he couldn't escape anymore was, at what cost? Back in the ambulance, Brian sat longer than necessary before turning the key. The man's words echoed louder than the siren ever could. Then one day, it's just gone. Brian thought of Sandra, of Kyla growing older without him noticing the exact moments it happened, of the nights he came home so empty he barely spoke, mistaking exhaustion for peace. Had staying become habit instead of calling? Or was there something still forming, something he couldn't see yet because he'd never allowed himself to look? The radio crackled again. Another call, another need. Brian started the engine. But this time, as the ambulance pulled away from the curb, he didn't feel hollow. He felt aware. And that, he knew, was the beginning of something far more dangerous than fatigue. It was the beginning of a question he could no longer postpone. The call didn't come until late afternoon. Brian was back at the station, wiping down a counter that didn't really need it, when the supervisor asked him to step into the office. No urgency in his voice. No warning either. "Sit," the man said, closing the door. Brian did. On the desk lay a thin folder. Brian recognized his own name on the tab before the supervisor spoke. "We've been reviewing staffing," the man said. "Response times, burnout rates, training gaps." Brian waited. He had learned long ago that filling silence rarely helped. "You've been here longer than almost anyone," the supervisor continued. "And your numbers, under pressure, under stress, are steady. Not just competent, steady." Brian felt a familiar tightening. Praise always made him uneasy. It felt like something you had to earn again immediately. "We're starting a new unit," the supervisor said. Peer response. High-stress calls. Younger crews. People who freeze after the fact. Brian understood before the words finished forming. "We want you to lead it." The room felt smaller. "I'm not looking for a desk," Brian said carefully. The supervisor nodded. "That's why this works. You'd still be in the field. Just differently. Fewer calls. More presence. Presence. Brian thought of the man on the floor at the retirement complex, of the way his own calm had steadied another human being without effort or performance. "And if I say no?" Brian asked. "Then nothing changes," the supervisor said honestly. "You keep doing what you've always done." That was the problem. Brian drove home slower than usual. The sun was already dipping low, staining the winter sky in pale gold and gray. He passed streets he'd driven hundreds of times, suddenly aware of how much he'd missed while moving through them on autopilot. Sandra noticed it immediately when he walked in. "You're thinking too hard," she said. Brian exhaled. "They offered me something." She waited. "I don't know if it's a way forward," he said, "or a way of admitting I'm tired." Sandra crossed the room and took his hands. "Those two things don't have to be enemies." That night, Brian lay awake long after the house went quiet. He thought about faith, not the loud kind, not the kind people talked about, the kind that showed up every shift without applause, the kind that held steady even when it didn't know what it was holding for. For the first time, Brian allowed himself to consider something he'd always pushed away, that maybe faith wasn't asking him to endure forever. Maybe it was asking him to change, without abandoning who he was. The idea scared him more than exhaustion ever had, but it also felt honest. And honesty, he was learning, had its own kind of courage. Brian said yes on a quiet morning. No ceremony, no speech, just a signature on a form and a handshake that lingered half a second longer than necessary. The first shift in the new role felt unfamiliar in small ways. He wasn't the first one through the door anymore. He didn't carry the stretcher. He stood back, watched, waited. It was harder than he expected, not because he wanted control, but because he had spent so long believing his value lived only in motion. The young EMT he rode with that day froze after a call went sideways. Not during it. After. Hands shaking. Eyes fixed on nothing. Brian didn't rush him. He sat beside him on the bumper of the ambulance, the cold seeping through their jackets. "You did what mattered," Brian said quietly. "The rest catches up later." The young man nodded, breathing slowly, like someone learning a new language. Brian felt something loosen in his chest. This, he realized, was still service. That evening, Brian came home before dark. Max was the first to notice, skidding across the floor toward the door. Kyla followed, surprised to see him so early. Sandra met his eyes across the room and smiled. Not wide, not relieved. Just steady. "How was it?" she asked. Brian thought for a moment. "Different," he said, "but right." They ate together, talked about small things, laughed once unexpectedly. Later, Brian stepped outside alone. The air was cold, clean, the world quiet in that way that felt earned. He thought back to the ambulance window, the hollow feeling, the question he'd been afraid to ask. How long can I keep this up? Now he understood the answer. Long enough to listen, long enough to pass something on, long enough to come home whole. Brian went back inside, closing the door gently behind him. Faith hadn't asked him to break himself to be useful. It had waited patiently, until he was ready to believe that staying true didn't always mean staying the same. And in that understanding, calm finally felt like peace.